Hello, this is James from James Films, and today I'm going to be doing a longer breakdown of a quick time-lapse video that I made a couple months back. I based this render off of an image that you see here from Ruben Wu that I then recreated in Eevee, leveraging primarily Quixel assets and some other really great assets and add-ons for Blender that I'll get to in just a second here. I released this video a while back, all strung out for Patreon, but I wanted to release it here. So if you want to get access early to my videos, head over to my Patreon. It's linked in the description. You can also see it here in the video. This first part of the video is all about sculpting. And I'm not a master of sculpting by any means, but it's very useful in Blender and it's really quick and easy. And there's a lot of really great brushes that you can leverage to just mess around with and learn and create. I encourage you, the best way really honestly to learn this, I encourage you to just explore and just experiment. Make mistakes, kind of struggle through things, and just see what you can do. What I like to do is first add a little bit of geometry to our plane, and then set up a basic camera angle here using Instagram dimensions of 1200 by 1500. I set the focal length to 35 millimeters for our camera, and then I'm going to zero it out so that it is in line with our XY plane. You can see the view on the right. This is just kind of how I like to arrange my windows. I've got my reference image there in the bottom right. I've got what's going to be my rendered view up in the top right there. And then you can see my workspace. It's got a texture layout and also just the main 3D viewport. I mess around a lot with the viewport display options, including turning up the Passepartout so that you're just seeing what the camera is going to render out and nothing outside of it. I also really like to turn on composition guides, specifically rule of thirds and center, to get an idea for where things should be framed up for the optimal look in my viewport. I also like to set in the in and out points here for what is going to be our mist pass, and I'll get kind of more into that as we get on later. But let's open up our sculpting mode here. You can see that in the top left of our screen, opening it up. And then I turn on Dyntopo, Dynamic Topology, just to have some nice geometry for our scene as we're starting to sculpt this out here. The brush I use probably the most for just initially getting things sculpted up is the Inflate brush. It's really quick to just pull things up and just kind of fill out your scene a bit here. And then I'm constantly tapping shift while I'm left clicking too to smooth things out. You can see sometimes you get these kind of jagged edges or a little bit too sharp of a pull up on your inflation. And this really goes for any brush. If you kind of just want to smooth things out, you can just hit shift while you're clicking and move things around. I jockey back and forth between that and the grab brush, which just can very quickly just yoink stuff up in the 3D space here. It's a very sharp thing, so you do have to do quite a bit of smoothing just to make sure that this looks prim and proper. But you can see I'm basically just trying to match what you're seeing in that reference image from Ruben, which I believe he actually took for a really cool concert with Rufus Du Sol, one of my favorite groups. Really awesome stuff that they put out, but it was made somewhere out in the desert. You can comment in the description what desert this is, I'm actually forgetting. But a really cool piece and really interesting topography that you see here. You got some kind of rocky mountains in the distance, and then this kind of interesting, almost little rocky fireplace looking thing here in the middle. So I'm just kind of sculpting this out and just trying to give myself an initial block in the 3D space. And what I'm actually going to do is go back into this and start to fill out the scene with objects from Quixel. So I'll be importing those in a second here. So this is just kind of giving me a basic idea of, you know, the 3D space, where the mountains are, where the rocks and stuff are, that I should kind of fill out in my scene. It doesn't have to be pretty. In fact, it's not going to look very pretty. As you can see here, lots of kind of just strange little bumps and hills that I've added in here. And what I, again, will encourage you is don't try to follow my motions exactly one-to-one. I really don't think that's the best way to learn 3D software in general. Don't directly copy what you're seeing here. Try to reinvent it. Try to just experiment with it. You know, even pause this video and just have some fun just trying to sculpt something that you see. You know, maybe it's an image that you've taken, or maybe there's some reference photo. Just try to create something that you see in nature, just sculpting out some quick hills. And this is really honestly the best way, I think, to learn the software, specifically the sculpting part of this, is just by trial and error. It's not going to look perfect always, but you know, you can always go back in and kind of fix things here as you work. This is just for me to just kind of get a basic idea and add a little bit of imperfection to the surface. You know, there's no surface really out in the wild that's perfectly flat. You know, you're going to find little bumps and crevices and creases and all kinds of things. So what you're trying to do in Capture Hero Sculpting is just a little bit of that imperfection, you know, adding a little bit of bumps and these little divots and things into your topography. So that's what I'm doing here, and I really think this gets me pretty close to a nice looking scene. And it's good time now to move on to the initial lighting setup. I like to start this as early as possible because I really think the lighting for me defines the mood of the scene and kind of helps me as I'm starting to place objects into my scene. I'm going to use an add-on called Physical Starlight and Atmosphere, and I was using this back in, I think, October of last year. I made this piece, but I actually made this back in October. They've recently updated their software to have clouds be added in as well, but I'm using an older version here, so I don't have that option. But still, there are a ton of really great options with this software, specifically the atmospheric effects that you can achieve with this with just a couple clicks. I use the color dropper to kind of pick some colors selectively from the reference image to kind of get that interesting blue haze to the atmosphere that you see. There's this interesting kind of bright, maybe something like city lights or something in the distance, adding some light pollutions to our scene here just over those mountains. That kind of fades in a nice gradient to a deeper blue as you get up into the higher atmosphere. And you can simulate this super quickly and also even add in procedural stars as you see I'm doing here. And already, with just a couple clicks, we've got a great scene. So now it's time to start moving over to importing assets from Quixel to our scene. I found a couple assets that are these Icelandic lava spires and other rocks that I'll be adding into the scene. And this add-on integrates just so well with Blender, but also with other 3D software too, including Cinema 4D, Unreal Engine especially. They've got some great stuff that integrates super well with that. But I'm just using it for Blender here. You can do this for really any software as well, but you can see I just imported that spire in, just took a couple seconds to load, and we've got this really great photo scan rock that we can now manipulate and add into our scene. You see I'm trying to kind of blend it in with the hills in the distance that I've kind of sculpted up there. And again, this is just a lot of trial and error. I'm going to keep coming back to these rocks, you'll see, as I move things around and kind of readjust things just to make them blend a bit better. I also want to add in a texture for that ground layer here. And so I've got a couple saved here. And the one I'm going to be trying to use is one that matches pretty closely one-to-one with those Icelandic rocks. So I'm searching in Quixel's database for a rock texture. And again, I'm going to be kind of referencing our image here. You see it's kind of this like tannish color, lighter grayish color. There's this great rough layered rock here that I have purchased that looks great and I think will work well for our scene. I'm also going to right click and go to where I have this saved on my computer and copy that file path. You'll see why in just a second. I'm going to unwrap my geometry here just so I've got that to work with as I add in the texture setup. And what's great about Quixel's textures is they already come prepackaged with everything plugged directly into it. So that when you actually load this up in your scene, it took a second to load here, you can actually see it's already got a principal texture setup on there. It's looking a little bit funky just because of how we set it up with dynamic topology, and it's also not using our UVs that we've unwrapped here just yet. So I'm just going to add in a mapping node and a texture coordinate node to set up with our scene and just make sure that we're using our UVs that we've unwrapped for this. Again, apologies for my voice. I've got a little bit of a cold here that I'm recovering from, but I wanted to make this tutorial and get this out to you guys as well. It's been a bit of a busy couple weeks here, so I'm hoping to get a video out for you. I've got another really fun video coming out soon too, so keep an eye out for that. It's a contest actually as well. Little Easter egg there for that if you've watched through this video so far. So you can see I've got this unwrapped here and it's looking pretty good so far. And you can always mess around with the UVs as well by going into the image editor, UV editor, and then just kind of scaling things up. Texture scale is pretty important, so definitely take some time to make sure that this looks proper. You don't want the rocks looking like massive in your scene because it's not going to be true to scale. You're trying to match this up as closely as possible. And I am going to be laying over this, so I'm not really as concerned about, the texture not looking as like high res, close to the camera as possible. I'm going to be putting other rock assets over there. This is just kind of like a base ground layer just to get the scene set up as I start to layer more things in to my render. You see I'm going back to that lava spire again, and I'm actually using Alt-D to making a linked duplicate of this. So this is actually not just duplicating the geometry, but it's just kind of making as if you're instancing it as well across your scene. So it's just kind of making a nice little copy that you can then move around. Now keep in mind, if you make changes like sculpting or adjustments to the original model that you're instancing, the issue you're going to run into is it's going to be updating that change for all of your linked duplicates. So just keep an eye on that. I've also imported some really nice kind of scatter rock assets from Quixel here. You can see they come kind of all stacked on top of each other. So this is just almost like assembling a Lego set, if you will, where I've just kind of separated all these individual pieces and I'm then clicking them into place in my scene. And this is another part where just really take your time with this. There's no right or wrong way to kind of fill out your scene, but just keep your reference in mind, keep it true to the actual environment that you're seeing in your reference photo. So I was seeing kind of a lot of these scattered boulders that are almost larger in the rim and kind of smaller as you get towards the center and kind of more gravelly and finer grained in that middle, almost like a sand that you're seeing there. So I'm trying to fill out the scene with that in mind, kind of keeping this cratered look in the middle and having larger and larger rocks as it scales out in the scene. I'm scaling these rocks, moving them around, and you can constrain the scaling to certain axes by just hitting like S and Z, that will just scale along the Z axis, S and Y just to scale on the Y, for example, or S and then Shift Z to just scale in that XY plane. I use these hotkeys all the time, and sorry I don't have the shortcut screencast keys turned on. I actually recorded this video a while back, like I said, in October before I'd started using that in last year. So for this video, I don't have those available, so apologies for that. If you have any questions, if you see me kind of clicking something around here really quickly, leave a comment with a timestamp, and I will be happy to go through and tell you exactly what I'm doing there with my mouse and keyboard. Sorry about that. But yeah, again, just take your time to fill these things out and add in a lot of really fun detail to the scene. What I really like about these Quixel assets is that they hold up really well, you know, whether they're far away from the camera or they're close up, and they don't really bog down the scene too much, at least these smaller asset scales. You can also control the dimensions of these things too, in terms of the texture scale. So if you're actually going into your export settings for Quixel, you can make it just like a 1K texture or 2K, 4K, or all the way up to 8K. What I do caution with this is, depending on the memory that you have for your computer and how quick your computer is, just make sure that you're not overloading with unnecessary textures. You don't really need 8K textures for something that's going to be like a mile in the distance. So just really keep an eye out for the sizes of the textures that you're using. So this is an issue I've run into in the past when I first started out with 3D. You want to make something amazing, so you're just throwing all these things in the scene, like all kinds of assets and rocks and stuff. And very quickly, your scene is running in slow motion, which is really tough. It's tough to actually edit and create and see your results in real time when your just scene is really bogged down. What I like about Eevee, and actually I started really doing a lot of work initially in 3D with Eevee, just because I didn't have a great computer, and Eevee was real time, so it updates in the viewport, and you can see just basically almost one-to-one with almost no lag time whatsoever, the changes that you're making in your 3D viewport. So you can see as I'm moving rocks around here, without any really refresh at all, you're seeing the results in the viewport, the rendered mode of Eevee, which when I was initially using Cycles, you're kind of fighting through noise and fighting through grain. And what's great about Cycles now, and I've used it a lot more now that I've obviously got a better computer, but also Cycles has implemented a really great denoising that a lot of other third-party renderers like Redshift and Octane already have built in, that you can turn on. And I actually use the optics denoising a lot because I have an NVIDIA GPU, and almost instantly, as if you're in Eevee, it's refreshing your viewport, and you're not really fighting through noise. It's denoising. Your scene, obviously, it's not looking as high detail because it's kind of smoothing things out as it's denoising at low samples, but you're getting a really good idea for your scene almost instantaneously as if you're working Eevee. So also Cycles, the lighting tends to look a little bit better. You have to work a little bit harder in Eevee, as I'll get to later on in this video, to actually show you how to do some really nice lighting in Eevee and kind of adjust in your settings and make things look great. Cycles kind of does it, automatically because of its ray tracing, but it's, not as hard as you think in Eevee to get something looking good. And especially with add-ons like Physical Starlight and Atmosphere, you can get a really good look with just a couple clicks, as you saw earlier on. And with adding in a little bit more volumetrics and some passes, render passes to your scene, it's going to look excellent. So sorry for that little sidebar. I just wanted to walk you through, just the process of this and just kind of how to think through things. Not just as an artist, but also as a kind of a technician, if you will, thinking about your computer settings, keeping that in mind as you're working, not making your computer catch on fire. I often see comments in the Blender YouTube community where people are talking about their computer catching on fire. They've got a potato laptop or whatever that they're working with. You shouldn't really be constrained by your hardware with a lot of this stuff if you think smart and try to optimize your scene. to play well with Blender. So you can see I'm just importing more assets here. There's some other great Icelandic rock photo scans in the Quixel database. And you can see my computer right on cue actually is starting to bog down a bit here. This is as I'm importing some of these new assets and then just trying to make the textures visible in the viewport. It takes a second or two to load, but don't worry, just give it a chance. Blender is trying its best, guys. But there it is, that new Icelandic rock here. And you can see I'm just kind of trying to match these to the topography that I sculpted initially in this scene. I'm taking a little bit of liberties here and kind of moving things around. And what's great is that these jagged rocks kind of look almost exactly like the same profile from Ruben's photo, which looks really great and kind of gives you some nice details that are these nice kind of secondary and tertiary details to your scene, in addition to kind of the overall macro scale of your landscape. A lot of really great details in the photo scans that really just pop as you start to kind of layer them and put them on top of each other. Once again, I'm continuing to do that Alt-D strategy of making linked duplicates of the rock, so I'm not adding too much extra geometry to my scene, and then just scaling them, rotating them around. You'd be surprised, actually, when you just make subtle motions like that's the same rock just rotated like, I don't know, 90 degrees. Your eye actually can't tell that that's the same rock because it looks different. It's rotated differently, it's scaled slightly differently. So just at least at first glance, you're not picking out the same details from the other rocks. So you can really quickly use a lot of the same assets to fill out your scene. And now that we've got some assets kind of started in here, I'm gonna jump on to the next step of this, which is gonna be some really fun particle editing. So what I'm going to be doing here is, I'm actually going to be doing environmental aspects here. I jumped the gun a bit. What I'd like to do is actually kind of define a bit more of the atmospheric settings and kind of make Eevee look a bit better. So I actually go into the color management tab in the render settings and change it from just the medium contrast that it defaults to a higher contrast, which I just think looks a little bit more filmic, a little bit more contrasty, obviously, and just generally a nicer look to it. I add in a massive cube to my scene, delete the initial texture that it comes with, and then I'm going to make this our volume material, where I'm going to be actually making importing a principled volume node to this, connecting the output to the volume input of the material output. And then we can tweak around from some settings here. This will take a second to kind of process in Eevee here, but you can see we've completely overloaded our scene with this volume. So what we're actually going to want to do is first just make it wired so we can actually see our scene in the viewport display options. And then I'm just going to kind of adjust the colors here to make it kind of that bluish hue slightly, and then really lower this density down a bit here so it's not overpowering our scene. This is just going to add in some nice atmospheric volumetrics to our scene, and it gives us something kind of fun to work with here as we get a little bit further along into the tutorial. I'm just going to kind of bring this down so that it's at the base level here of our scene. So just so we have like a little bit of a haze. There's a bit of a sharp fall off, and what you can actually do is maybe add in a bit of a noise texture gradient to kind of adjust that fall off so it's not as harsh. But, you know, honestly, this is just such a subtle volumetric that I really don't even need this too much. You know, I can play around with the bloom settings a bit. I really think this is what Eevee's strength is, in particular, is the bloom. So when you're starting to add in lighting effects, it looks really awesome. You can adjust some other things like volumetric properties, like bringing the tile size down a bit to have a bit higher resolution of the volumetrics. Also add in volumetric shadows, and then I like to turn on a high bit depth for my shadows, which I just think makes it look a bit nicer generally. And then what I'm going to do here is start to try to model these like little light cones that you see here. I believe Ruben made those by using a drone and actually attaching like I think little lights to the drones, or maybe they're actually things in the desert. I'm actually forgetting what he did for this. But I'm just going to add in a cylinder and make it very low poly by just making it 3 vertices. So we've kind of got this like triangular tube thing here. I'm going to bring this up and then just scale it quite a bit in the Z axis, and then scale it down in the XY plane. So we've got this very large tube here, which I'm going to make emissive and look really, really cool. So we're kind of having it look like those big beams kind of all over my scene here. And again, really tapping into Eevee's strength here with the emission materials by just changing the principled BSDF to an emission. This takes a second to load here. Or I tried to make it glass first, accidentally. Let's make an emission. And then just really cranking this emission up. The bloom is going to really make this look nice and soft. And already we've got a great look with just a couple clicks here. You can kind of adjust the color a bit, maybe make it a little bit bluer. But this is looking great. you know, I will come back to this again and kind of play around with the settings a bit more to make it sure that it kind of adjusts well in our scene and plays well. But the bloom is looking mighty fine here, if I do say so myself. And what you can do is just add in a point light too, just to really accentuate that spotlight in the middle. It's going to be kind of hard to get that directionality with just an emissive material, but I'm just cranking the power up quite a bit on that light and then placing it right in the middle of our scene, making it a little bit blue, just a twinge of blue there, just to make it a little bit more colorful. And then let's just crank this up a bit more to like 1600 watts. And that's looking pretty great. You've got this spotlight in the middle. What you're noticing is we're not really getting that much cratered effect, but we'll come back to that in a little bit as I show you kind of how I refine the details in the scene and get a bit closer to a final product. So I'm going to rename this to our rods and then just group all these rocks up here just so they're kind of out of my way by putting them in a new collection, just calling it geology. And this just kind of is good scene organization. I think it's generally helpful to label your scenes. You know what you're looking at. You're not sifting through like hundreds of layers to find the objects that are important to you. And again, I'm just going to do looped duplicates of these, like by doing Alt-D and just kind of moving things around, scaling them around here in the scene, and then just manually placing them so that they kind of match up generally the location that they were in the reference from Ruben. And so this is just a really quick process here of just kind of moving things around and scaling them, placing them in the scene, and really using that 3D viewport to make sure that it is looking nice and kind of matches up well with our reference image. So that's looking pretty decent. You've got some up there on these top rocks, just kind of moving them around. You can kind of see how this is already coming together really well. I really already like how the background is looking in our scene. I just kind of move these around. Again, experiment, just make, you know, cool art, just have fun with this. Don't try to follow me one-to-one here and get exactly the same location with these rods. Just enjoy yourself, just make it happen and move things around. So yeah, this is looking pretty cool. And just kind of continuing to scale these rods around, moving them around. And keep in mind too, just one note for these loop duplicates. As I said earlier, if you try to change the properties on one, it's going to change it for everything. So if I was to change the strength or the color in the surface properties of the material that you see over on the right, it's going to change that for every single one. So if you did want to actually have different brightnesses or different colors for these things, you would actually have to just duplicate that normally, like doing Shift D, and then creating a new material, like just hitting the plus icon there and then making a new material, or just making a duplicate of that material and then just kind of changing the colors and stuff of it. But yeah, just keep in mind that these looped, keep such a tongue twister here, looped duplicates, or linked duplicates rather, they are what you're going to just be adjusting. I added in some depth of field of the camera too, and had it focus on that central rod that we have in our frame, which seemed to be the focal point for Ruben as well. And just again, adjusting the bloom settings here a bit so that we're really bringing out the mighty fine colors from our little tubes here. So that's looking pretty cool, huh? This is a pretty decent start, but there's a lot more that we can do with this. And I'm definitely gonna do a lot more, kind of adjusting the focal length of our camera so that's a bit more wide angle here, capturing more of that scene, and we have that more of that defined crater in the middle where our view is kind of drawing the eye in. I'm actually gonna adjust the starlight sun a bit here so you can kind of see how that's affecting the background there. Just by changing the angle of it, it's changing the luminosity, the brightness of the background too. So if I'm pulling this up, it makes it darker. And then if I'm pushing it down, it makes it lighter. It's just changing the angle of the sun, but it has a lot more influence on the environmental aspect as well. And what I like so much about this add-on compared to HDRIs is that you have so much more control over your sky. You can do so many different things with it to really just make a unique piece every single time. And then you can actually animate this. I've got a video up on my Patreon now where I talk about how I actually animate time lapses for my scenes, which is a lot of fun too. So you can check that out in the description as well. And I use entirely this add-on for it. Just so powerful and really gives you some great results really, really quickly. So that is a pretty good start for our environment here. I'm just again tweaking a couple more things, moving lights around, and I think we are off to a pretty good start here. I do like to return to things quite a bit here, so you know, in some of the next parts here, I'm going to kind of speed through things a bit here. I actually, one important thing, turn on contact shadows. for your point lights that you add in. I think that's important to have as well. What you'll notice is that it just generally makes your shadows look a bit crisper. It's just one of the little hacks with Eevee that's important to kind of note. And you can see this is kind of intersecting strangely with our kind of emission tube thing here too. So I'm kind of trying to hide that over to the side a bit here so that it's not really clashing as much with it. And it's looking pretty good. So I'm actually going to show you the mist pass here as well, which is very important. You can just enable that by going into your layer or your render passes. And you can actually change in the world settings the fall off of it. So if you're showing in the rendered view this image kind of grayscale here, the black parts, the darker parts of the image are the ones that are closer to the camera, and the white parts are the ones as you get further away. And I think this just adds some really nice volumetrics to your scene really, really quickly, and it looks pretty great. You don't need a whole lot of samples. You see me adjusting here with Eevee, because I feel like Eevee, you really don't need more than like 64 samples really for it. I feel like mostly it comes out looking pretty nice. But now I'm getting onto kind of an experimentation part here, which is what I again harp on all the time in my tutorials, is just have fun, play around, see what works and what doesn't work, and really just have fun with your scene. You can see I'm just adjusting the UVs here, trying different texture planes for that base ground layer, moving rocks around, adjusting things in the scene, adding in different textures again, going through and moving things around. Just have fun with it, experiment. You know, there's no right or wrong way to make this happen. Now I'm going to move on to scattering particles in our scene, specifically rocks and pebbles. And I've got this small limestone rocks pack from Quixel that I'm going to import here. Take a second to load up into Blender. And I'm going to be using the add-on Graswald for this one specifically to make this happen. You can also use other add-ons like Scatter or just built-in scatter particles for Blender too. I just really like the flexibility of both Graswald and Scatter for how these look. And what I'm going to first do is add all these rocks to a collection. Just call it limestone rocks. And then we'll save that out. So we've got this collection now of our limestone rocks. I'm going to go to the Graswald tab and just hit the plus icon. This creates a new particle system on our plane. We'll take a second here to load up because we've got quite a bit of geometry in our plane. And there it is. We've got this system. You can see it's just looking like little strands of hair. But if you add in our collection to it, you can see you can create a new group and actually do some nice adjustments with the distribution by painting things into your scene. This is just really fun, and I always enjoy doing this, kind of like painting the rocks in and the particles in. I do this all the time with grass and stuff too. You can really kind of draw the viewer's eye into the scene by just quickly painting things together, adjusting the intensity of your brush and kind of painting things in, and just have fun with it. I always enjoy doing this and just kind of layering things on. What I'm trying to do is kind of get in the crevices between the rocks, where in the reference image you can kind of see these smaller fine-grained particles or little rocks and pebbles and stuff kind of scattered in between. And I just recalculate the density and you'll see those are our particles there. You can up the density here a bit or decrease it a bit for this stuff. And I'm actually going to change the collection to those limestone rocks that we pulled in before. And now you see we've got some nice rocks scattered all over our scene. It's looking pretty cool. And it was really quick just to add that in there. And you can go back and keep making adjustments to this with the brush if you want. I'm going to just add in a bright contrast node here just to try to get the limestone rocks to match a little bit more with the kind of base layer of our scene here. Just bringing the brightness down a bit, making it look a little bit browner kind of here. You can add in a hue saturation node too. This isn't always the optimal way to do this. Typically you want to actually edit the raw JPEG file that or whatever file that you're using for the texture. But sometimes I would like to make very subtle little tweaks to the saturation in just the texture coordinates or texture setup this way. You can see that's matching much better now with our surrounding rocks. It's a pretty good scene. I think it looks pretty nice in general. And again, you can always revisit this and make things look different. I'm going to just label this as well, limestone rocks in Graswald. And you can always come back and adjust these later. I'm going to pull the size down just a little bit because they look a little bit too strong. But really quickly, you've got some nice extra details here. We're kind of going from the macro details of those huge rocks to the smaller details of the rocks and boulders kind of around this crater and down to even finer details. So I'm going to be detailing a little bit more here too, and I've just accelerated this as well just because it's kind of boring to just watch me moving rocks around. But you can see I'm just kind of filling out these craters with more assets from Quixel, just layering things in, pulling things around, spinning things around, doing the linked duplicates as well. adjusting my atmosphere. It's always a push and pull with this. I feel like I'm always adjusting things and going back, and that's the power of Eevee. As I said earlier on in the video, you're seeing all these changes in real time, which is awesome, so you can really, as an artist, iterate so much quicker than before, and it always looks great. And it's really easy to just make these changes and see your results directly in the viewport as you're editing. So now I'm going to get into a very important part here, which is adding plants. And for this one, I used one of my favorite add-ons called Polygon IQ, and they have this great add-on Botan IQ that comes with a lot of great plants and shrubs and things, and even pots and stuff. And so I used the sumac bush here. I made it editable, which is important to check that make editable, as opposed to just using the collection, because it's going to allow us to actually adjust the textures for this little shrub bush as well here. I could, place these in my scene using a particle system as well, but there aren't really that many bushes that you can see of in the reference image. So I kind of found it easier to just duplicate these guys and kind of move them around and manually place them in the scene, just so I could get them looking like how I wanted them to, since there are only maybe 10 bushes that you can see in the reference image to begin with. And if you actually click on this bush, you can see it's got a great texture set up there that pops up. And I actually tapped into this quite a few times to adjust the hue and saturation, just so it matched up a little bit better and wasn't as kind of this deep green. The kind of bushes that you're seeing in this reference are almost like more washed out, sandy looking, kind of like drier, that they've been sitting there for years and years with very little water to tap into, and they've adapted to their environment. The sumac bush kind of comes in looking a little bit too green. So I kind of tried to pull that down here with these hue saturation values, just to see what I could get with it, just to dry it out a little bit more. And yeah, it generally looked pretty good. I think it still is maybe a little bit too green, but you can always adjust this in post by kind of pulling down the saturation on the greens a bit, since that's really the only place in the image where there are greens to begin with. I just scatter these manually, like I said, and just rotate them, scale them, kind of reposition them so that they're kind of coming out of these crevices of the rocks that you saw in the reference image there as well. And this is a fun process to do as well, because you really feel like you're, Bob Ross here, kind of painting in these little bushes, little happy bushes into your scene. It's a lot of fun to do. I always like adding plants and stuff into the render, because I think it adds a little bit of extra details and just kind of makes you wonder. It's like, well, how did that plant get there? How did that plant, evolve, and where is it coming from? Botan IQ is a really great add-on. I have quite a few plant add-ons. I feel like I spend more money on digital plants than I do on actual plants in real life, but maybe I should probably change that, eventually get more plants for my apartment. And I'm working on it. I've got 2 bonsai trees that I'm currently nursing as well that are really nice. But I'm hoping to get some more plants too. So if you've got any recommendations for cool plants that I should get for my apartment, leave a comment in the description and I'll look into it. I'm just trying different types of bushes here too, because, you can only get so far duplicating the same thing over and over again. It does start to look pretty similar. So just adding in these extra bushes here just to make it a little bit different, adding in some different details, adds that imperfection, adds that more natural look to the environment. And I've said this before and I'll say it again, but it's all about the little details that really makes a render photorealistic. Just taking that extra time to really add in the imperfections and really study your reference or references when you're creating an image really takes it that extra step. I think it's just so important to go out and gather references in the first place. I've got a great one I'm working off here from Ruben Wu. But, even if you're just making a scene completely from scratch, which I often do, what I like to do is just walk outside and just look at, the foliage, look at the trees, look at the lighting and the way it hits the leaves or the rocks in real life, and then try to replicate that in 3D. It's so easy to think that, oh yeah, I know what a mountain looks like, or oh yeah, I know what a forest looks like. And then you open up your 3D software and it's like, yeah, I've got no idea how a forest looks. So it's just so useful to actually gather that reference by actually going outside if you can and observe things, or, if you can't actually visit a place in real life, looking for really good reference images of it and then pulling that into 3D. It's always a fun process. And I feel like even if you're not posting the stuff online publicly, it's just a good exercise for you just to go through and just try to learn and see what you can do and create a scene with these different, skills in mind. It really helps develop a good skill set if you kind of mess around and just try to learn and, just try to replicate a reference image. This is how I really learned, I think, Blender and other 3D software specifically, was just making those mistakes, experimenting around, and just trying to make things. I wasn't often publishing the stuff that I created publicly. it was just really an exercise for me. You know, I tried to be as regular as possible with it. You know, there is this kind of trend of doing daily renders, which can honestly get pretty exhausting if you're doing a lot. But I really think even if you're just dedicating like 10 minutes a day or something on making just a couple little things, even just messing around with the sculpt brush or a specific tool in your 3D software, that's all valuable. That's teaching you something. You know, that's teaching you how not to do something even too, like when you're making mistakes with your renders. But you're just taking the time to kind of experiment and play around, and really helps you learn. So you see I've added a couple different bushes in here as well, other different little foliage stuff as well. You know, I've tried to match the plants as closely as possible from the reference image. Taking a couple liberties here, you know, maybe the plant kind of palm things I've just added in here wouldn't actually grow out in the desert, but you know, it's all right. I'm also importing this Marram grass asset from Quixel, which comes with a whole bunch of different strands of grass that I'm just going to scatter across my scene the same way I scattered those boulders. So what I do here is, you see the Marram grass is imported. I'm just going to delete the hierarchy and then just add all these to a collection. And I'm going to call this the Marram grass collection. Hit OK. And I'm just going to kind of pull these out of the scene so that they're not there. And then what we can do is actually go to Graswald, add in another system, create new settings. And then I'm going to make this one my Marram grass. And this is where we're going to be scattering our grass particles across our scene. And I'm just going to add in a new density layer. And what I'm going to do is kind of paint in between those rock crevices again around the crater, but just ever so slightly with this Marram grass. It's a light touch here with this, just to make it look really nice. Just again, taking this time to kind of go through and, you know, add in those extra little details really takes it that extra step here as well. So you see I've got it really very subtle painting in here. I'm even kind of undoing things here a couple times as I go through and kind of just paint ever so delicately this grass into the crevices around that crater. I was kind of seeing these like tiny little blades of grass in between the plants in the reference image. It's kind of hard to even make it out. You can kind of see it in the bottom right there, but you know, it's at least looking like somewhat grass-like there. So I wanted to add in these little extra particles to really make it look extra special. So just continuing to paint through here. This is a really fun process of just kind of going through over and over and doing this. You can always revisit this again later and kind of keep coming back to it, but I'm just going to go to my Graswald settings here as well, recalculate the density, and let's change that collection from the Graswald custom one here to our Marram grass and see the fruits of our labor here. And that's looking pretty cool, but looking a little bit too big. So I'm going to actually decrease that size a bit there, quite a bit, you know, pull it down to like, you know, 0.1-ish, maybe even less. And then actually randomize the scale quite a bit too, so that it's just very slight detailing there of those rocks, or of the grass rather, in the scene. It's looking pretty nice. And I think we can kind of move on to the next step here, which is the real-time rendering. This is the power of Eevee, and why I really like working in Eevee as much as possible for scenes is the render takes just a couple seconds usually. And I'm actually gonna, when I render this out, show you in real time what this looks like. I'm not speeding this up at all. This is just how it is on an older laptop too. This was made last year before I built a new PC. And this is actually just how quick Eevee is. It's just gonna take a couple seconds here. You can see it's kind of processing my computer here. This is an older laptop. If you're interested in the specs of this, gosh, I can't even remember what they were. It was like, I think a 960 GPU from an NVIDIA, maybe like 8 gigabytes of RAM or something really weak like that. One of the older generation Intel CPUs, and like very little storage as well too. So I was always trying to use external hard drives to save my project files, but it's not a very good laptop. I'll just put that out there. And so even with that, you know, it's just taking a couple seconds here, you know, up to like maybe a minute to render this out, and there's our result. And it's looking great. So it took 41 seconds to render this out, which is pretty awesome. And so what I'm actually going to do is also save that out and save out the mist pass that I composited too, and take this over into Photoshop, where I'm going to add in the final compositing and little tweaks and details to really make this look awesome. I like to add the blend mode to screen for our mist pass and put it over top our top layer. And you see this just adds a little bit of more atmospheric touch to our render. You can just really bring that opacity down on it, just so it's a very subtle thing that you see there. I'm going to add in a levels adjustment and just kind of pull in the contrast there a little bit more. You can kind of just dial this in and then boost the highlights just a little bit more in our scene. So that's already looking pretty great as well. I have kind of got these like little weird bricks and stuff that I didn't notice were there, so I can just kind of paint those out using the healing brush. And that looks great to me. It was just kind of distracting me a little bit, that kind of weird pop of red that was there. And what I'm going to add in is a color LUT as well too. I like to add in typically. And you can kind of change these up a little bit as well. A lot of times they come in a little bit too overpowering, so you kind of have to dial these in a bit. But it's just fun to kind of like scroll through them and see one that kind of draws your eye in. I like this film stock 50 one here. But again, just really very subtle touching for this. I think you don't need to overpower your scenes a lot of times with the adjustment layers. It's all about striking that balance and making sure you're just adding very slight detailing to your scene to make it look excellent. I just boost the contrast just a little bit and pull down the brightness just a little bit on that background there. Overall, you can see it's kind of burning the highlights a little bit too much. And then I'm going to open up the Nik collection, which I've talked about before. It's a really great plugin that I think Google developed a number of years ago. I've used it for a number of years. Initially when I was actually just editing photos, but it works great for editing renders too, to kind of add that extra little filmic, almost like film photo look to your renders. It kind of comes packaged with a bunch of these presets, which I like to dial in and kind of make look a little bit more subtle, because I think they're pretty overpowering. Like you can see how sepia this one looks almost. So just kind of dialing in the strength of the different filters really can make it look pretty excellent as you're kind of defining the last couple details of your scene. You can also add very subtle grain to the film too, which I think looks really nice. And it kind of simulates like different profiles almost of like film cameras, which is pretty awesome. So just kind of adding in this for the analog effects is pretty nice. You can adjust the basic adjustments, dirt and scratches, lens vignette, film type and all really quickly with just a couple dials, and I think it looks pretty great just to add in those extra little Photoshop filmic details to the scene. And this is looking pretty photorealistic. I mean, you can let me know what you think of this in the comments. I made this a while back still, so don't be too harsh. You know, I've learned a lot since I made this, but I'm always open to critique as well. So if you got any comments on this one, let me know what you think in the description, and I'm happy to see what you guys create as well with this one too. But I had a lot of fun making this one, and just, you know, adding in these last details to the images really is always where I think the magic pops out, because it really does look very filmic, and it really does, you know, bring out the extra details in the photo by kind of adding, you know, some extra noise or grain, or just really boosting the contrast up a bit more. And now this almost looks like a photo to me. And this was made in Eevee, keep in mind, as well, which is pretty cool. You know, so Cycles I usually associate with, you know, the more photorealistic renders, but I think Eevee is slept on a little bit. I think you gotta, you know, work a little bit more, put a little bit more elbow grease into Eevee to make it happen and make it look a little bit more photorealistic. But you can, you know, you can achieve it. You can achieve great things with Eevee. It's possible. So, you know, if you've got not the best computer, you can have fun messing around with Eevee and making it look a bit more realistic. So again, I'm just kind of dialing in settings here, and I like to kind of hit this compare button up to the top here on and off, and this can very quickly cycle back and forth between the original and the adjusted. And you see the effect is very subtle, just has just a little slight touch to the render. And once I do that one, I add in the next one, which is the Color Efex Pro 4 filters. And this one comes with a whole bunch of really great adjustment layers that you can really quickly slap on and then add some changes to. And I like to use the skylight filter one to kind of add a little bit of like yellowish haze to the scene. Again, very subtle, like 3%. You saw not a lot of it. Just that little boost is enough to kind of make it look a little bit more special. I like this Pro Contrast one as well to kind of just add in selectively some dynamic contrast, this kind of correcting contrast as well, and then an overall color cast correction too. You can kind of just pull these up and down very quickly just to see the effect that it has on the render. But I think this just kind of makes the colors look a little bit more balanced out and really, really nice. And then the last one I like to use typically is this sunlight one too, which just adds in kind of a nice bloom, almost like an Orton effect kind of to the image as well, where it kind of blurs parts of it selectively, and it makes it just look really, really nice in general. So it's a lot of fun to kind of mess around with these ones to get a finished result. And again, just very subtle, you know, it's not, you know, 100% opacity on this one. I like to kind of pull these down as much as I can just to add that subtle effect into the render. And it really just makes a very big difference just having these subtle details in to the final piece. So this is the original photo from Ruben Wu, really cool piece. And this is my attempt to recreate it in Eevee. So let me know what you think of this, and be sure to subscribe and like this one if you like to see more kind of strung out tutorials like this, and I will catch you on the next one. Thanks for tuning in.